The basement. Manny from the Canadian podcast No Inner Monologue shared this story, and it's well worth your time. His family did not have a lot of resources when he was a kid. As a result, he and his uncle had to take on some extra work. His parents couldn't afford childcare, so he and his older brother spent their nights cleaning the Keg Steakhouse at the Toronto airport. They often brought him to the office with them. The work wasn't difficult and the pay was good. However, Manny's parents left after an incident one night, along with other paranormal occurrences. When Manny was around 11 years old, he and his uncle's girlfriend were at a table near the bar. It was just a casual conversation between Manny and the girlfriend of his uncle. They fell asleep, which was usual for them. Suddenly, Manny's uncle woke them up. He said, "Quick, wake up." He said, "We need to get to the basement. Your mom needs help moving some stuff. Hurry, it's urgent." The pair followed his footsteps down the stairs and into the basement. Yet just as they rounded the corner of the hall, they ran into him coming in the opposite direction. He appeared to be completely shocked to see them. Manny asked what's going on and what's the emergency. His uncle replied, "You and your dad yelled that you were locked in the basement and he couldn't open up the door. He told me to go to the car and get the crowbar to force it open." No. Manny claims you woke us up and dragged us downstairs to assist Mummy. Manny's uncle couldn't believe it. "When your dad and I were walking by the basement, we heard you calling for help." Then Manny's dad showed up, puzzled as to why his brother was holding a crowbar. His anger was sparked when he saw Manny with his brother's girlfriend. "That's not funny trying to scare us like that." He asked, "How did you get out?" As they talked about what had happened, the four of them stood in the hall and looked confused. Suddenly, Manny's mom came running over. There was something trapped in the basement. She sobbed and she needed help rescuing them. You can only imagine the panic that broke out when everyone realized that someone or something was trying to drive a wedge between their close-knit family members and force them all to go to the basement. They left as quickly as they could, and then a few more terrifying things happened that nobody could explain. Eventually, Manny's parents and uncle walked away from the restaurant. Number 4. Spirit creatures. In the 1960s, on one fateful night, two men were driving back from Annan, Scotland along the A75. There was hardly anyone else on the road since it was so late. After about 10 miles, the driver saw an elderly lady standing in the middle of the road, waving frantically. When the driver braked to avoid hitting her and knocking her down, she vanished. The two men were taken aback when they saw several figures emerge from the shadows and make a beeline for their car. Most of the figures resembled familiar animals like dogs and cats, but there were also some that looked completely unreal. Somewhere in the middle of the zoo, an elderly man surfaced. While he ran, his long white hair fell out behind him and his mouth gaped open in a silent scream. The driver swerved left and right across the road to avoid hitting the alien-looking things, but eventually realized that they weren't actually harming the vehicle. He became perplexed and wondered if it was all a dream. Instinctively, he looked over at his passenger and realized he wasn't hallucinating. Temperatures dropped significantly in the car, and the driver felt as though something was trying to take the wheel from him. Despite the cold, the two men felt as though they were suffocating as the passenger wound down his window, and they heard the terrifying sounds of cackling and shrieking. When the driver finally pulled over, the car began to violently rock from side to side. They both popped open the car's doors and stepped out. There was complete silence except for the sound of wind in the trees and their own shallow, panicked breaths. The two men got back in the car once they had calmed down and were eager to return home. But as soon as the driver started the engine, the animals came back, surrounding the car again. They were relieved to see some oncoming headlights as they drew closer to their destination. However, as they got closer, they saw that the big van wasn't moving, and they were going to smash right into it. The driver slammed on the brakes, but they did not activate. Both men braced themselves for impact, but the van, along with the animals and the old man, vanished into thin air. There was utter silence, and the road was deserted. The two men, exhausted from their encounter with the ghost, returned home as soon as possible. Number 3. The boy with no eyes. A Reddit user, Commando, shared his story of an encounter with paranormal entities. When he was about 10 years old, someone opened his bedroom door in the middle of the night, waking him up. He felt someone sit down next to him on the bed. Something was touching his leg, and he felt the bed sink under the weight, so he assumed it was his mother. But when he opened his eyes, it wasn't his mother there. It was a young boy with 2 blank orbs for eyes. The young boy, who looked to be around the same age as Commando, extended a hand that contained a box. Despite his shock, Commando reached out to take it, but the ghostly figure tugged it away. Once more, Commando reached for the box, commanding, "Give it," and blinked. The boy was long gone when he opened his eyes. but the impressions of where he had sat on the bed remained. 5 years later, one day Comando's friends visited him at his house to do some studying. While waiting for her parents to pick her up, she fell asleep. Commando woke his girlfriend when they arrived. She sat up and pointed to the corner of the room and went right back to sleep. Commando woke her up again and asked about her actions. She told him that she'd seen a little boy with no eyes staring at her from high up on the wall like Spider-Man. Commando was terrified and told her about the time he had met that boy when he was a kid. 5 more years passed and Commando and his girlfriend were still together. They also had a 2-year-old daughter. They live in the Commando's old room. Every night at the same time, his daughter began waking up and starting to talk. When Commando asked about who she was speaking to, she explained that she was talking to a nice little boy who got lost and was looking for his mother. Paranormal activity continued until the family moved into their own home. Number 2. The Room of Terror. In a lovely part of Edinburgh, Scotland, but not far from the Botanic Gardens, there is a small, spectacular area with a row of lovely homes. In the early 20th century, a couple purchased house number 17. The house had been abandoned for years for reasons unknown, so the ambitious couple bought it cheap with the intention of turning it into a boarding house. After settling in, it didn't take long for the newlyweds to notice that one of the attic rooms had a strange and unsettling feel to it. Nobody was eager to go into the room, let alone stay alone. No one was keen on visiting the chamber, much less spending any length of time there. Someone or something had always seemed to be monitoring them from within the room. A young girl who was helping out a housekeeper went up into the attic, but immediately ran back down again, crying and shouting. She fainted from the terror of the situation, and even after she regained consciousness, she wouldn't talk about what had terrified her. The boarding house at 17 quickly became infamous across the city, and word quickly traveled. The students at Edinburgh University started giving dares to see who would go and stay there the longest. Andrew Muir, one of the students, was a young man. He had a strong faith in God, but he was also curious about the afterlife and other forms of spirituality. Andrew approached the landowners and offered to conduct a controlled experiment by spending the night in the attic room. The owners were happy with Andrew's offer because it meant they could finally put an end to the whole thing. Word about the house had spread all over Edinburgh, which hurt their business because no one wanted a house that was haunted. They gave Andrew a bell with the instructions to ring it at the first signs of anything out of the ordinary. In the cold, uninviting attic space, Andrew was left to keep his watch. In the wee hours of the morning, a piercing cry of dread broke through the quiet of the night as the gusts rambled wildly. As soon as everyone heard the noise, they jumped out of bed and headed for the attic. Andrew was found dead on the floor with the bell by his side and a look of intense fear on his face when the doors slammed open. The poor kid apparently witnessed something so horrifying that it caused him to die of shock. Nobody ever went back to the attic. And then, 20 years later, the entire building was torn down. Number 1. The Haunted Attic. Someone named Dig saw on Reddit recalled how he had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a 1930s building in Melbourne, Australia. A few months later, when Dig returned home, he discovered a wooden board on the floor in 2 pieces. It was at least an inch thick and had been used to cover a hole in the bathroom ceiling that led to a small attic space. Dig was scared that someone was already in the attic and hoped that his landlord had maintenance planned. Dig sent pictures via email and requested that the landlord contact him immediately. But she said she hadn't done any work in the attic and the bathroom ceiling had been a problem for the last 2 tenants. The landowner repaired the board. About a month later, while Dig was sleeping, he heard noises coming from the attic, giving him the feeling that something was being followed. A terrible feeling, a noise from the attic that sounded like something was being tracked, and a feeling that someone was undoubtedly up there woke Dig up at 4 a.m. When Dig finally gathered the nerve to enter the bathroom, he switched on the light. He discovered that the new board was on the floor, split into 2 pieces. However, there was something else up there, the hushed voices of children. The same phrase kept coming up, "It's your turn." Dig was so frightened that he had to turn on all the lights and watch TV to relax. But the story didn't end there. Dexter, his pet parrot who was kept in the kitchen, started squawking. Diggs, being stressed, left the house to relax in his car until morning. When he got back to the apartment, he found that Dexter wasn't in his cage. Dig discovered him at the commode, splashing around to save its life. Dig called the landlord after washing and drying. "Wow," she said, "you heard the whispering too?" For over a year, Dig lived in that apartment, and several times during that time, he overheard whispering. That concludes Just Gotta Watch's today's episode. Thanks for watching.